Thank you all for carving out a little bit of your day to be with us here. I'm Andrew. I lead strategy here at Knapsack. I'm really excited to talk to some of the amazing folks we have here and share their perspective with you all. Before we do that, shameless plug. We do a lot of content and events and things like this here at Knapsack. We have, in particular, a series of design system leadership summits, which I think several of the people on the call have been to, and hopefully all of you get a chance to come to soon. These are amazing community events that are really more focused on fostering conversation and relationships, sharing perspective, learning what others are working on and struggling with, and getting a little sense of sanity. Honestly, it's a great group therapy event. So we have a few of these coming up. There are also probably going to be some others. We have been talking about an event in the Pacific Northwest. So we are going to continue to expand this list, trying to do these almost monthly if we can, although a little lull for the summer. So check them out. Go to our website. You can apply. We're always looking for people who are interested in speaking or hosting a discussion as well as part of these with your peers. Also, just keep an eye out on our site in general for upcoming webinars and additional content and exciting product updates. With that, we got some awesome people here who have a lot more experience in this, frankly, than I do. So I'm really excited to go around and introduce everyone. I'll do a quick sort of roundup of who's here, and then we can go around and maybe do an initial intro, and I'll pose a starting question. So Jeff here is a UX architect from Apiture. Jackie is a lead UX designer from OPIS, part of Dow Jones. Joe is an architect from Bill, and we have Jen from Integrate as UX team lead as well. And I want to call out that everyone who's here on their own, representing their own perspective and opinion. These are not the perspectives of their companies. We'll obviously talk about things as specifically as we can, while also being respectful of anything that's sensitive to individual product initiatives at each company. And so with that, I'd love to go around to everyone, and let's just start from the top, right? The topic of this talk is data-rich experiences and design systems for data-rich experiences, which, as we were just talking about as a panel here, is an interesting little sort of niche area to get into, because frankly, most product teams are still trying to figure out how to do systems well in general, right? How do we operate systematically? How do we get design and engineering and product to work in this way that lets us reuse stuff? Adding the element of data-rich or dense or heavy experiences. I'm curious, just as we go around, maybe Jeff, starting with you, just from a high level, like what first comes to mind? How does working on something that is particularly data-rich change your thought process, change your approach, or just what sort of challenges do you find that you encounter with that sort of project?
Sure. So hi, everyone. I'm Jeff Pelletier, as Andrew mentioned. I'm a former colleague of Joe's at Bill, so plenty of experience working in fintech. The thing that comes to mind for me really is data table. It's something that, or data grid, you might have heard it referred to as. It's one of the most complex components that any design system team will attempt to tackle, and it generally comes up. Every fintech company that I've been with that works on design systems, that is something that is discussed, and it's something that is brought to the team to figure out how to handle. And so I have some good examples of some of the data tables out in the wild, but that's definitely the thing that comes to mind first for me.
Yeah, I feel like the data table is infamous, even just because as I talk with design and engineering teams, right, it's a classic example of where even at a component level, it may be one component in design and it may be legitimately 15 components in engineering for
Yes.
The different elements of that. So yeah, we'll get into the data table. Jackie, also now with your last name spelled correctly. Sorry about that slide fail. Love to hear your perspective. What do you run into, whether it's about the data table or just how it shows up in your life as a company really focused on providing a lot of dense data, right?
Yes, definitely. So for those who are not familiar with OPIS, OPIS has a huge amount of data. So how we bring those data to our users and make it absorbable and consumable in an effortless way, it has always been on the top of our mind. On top of that, throw in the design system and the complexity of a system and how it ties in to every single aspect of our business and our sub companies and their needs. So it definitely makes the conversation even more interesting. And when we talk about data, it's not just numbers, it's also lots of news and reports, and also things like maps. So it's a lot. It's definitely multi-dimensional. And when we approach these type of things, it's definitely something that we wanted to make sure that everybody is involved. Yep.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, and I'm gonna want to come back to specifically the design process and how that sort of maybe is different, or what changes as you're looking in, you know, this type of environment. So I'm gonna come back to you for sure. Joe, awesome to have you here. How does sort of data rich, complex experiences, how does that show up in your day to day at Bill and with all the ongoing changes in the Bill ecosystem?
So, hi, I'm Joe. Currently, I'm a design systems engineer under the architecture umbrella at Bill. Kind of like what Jeff said. Like our app is pretty, reliant on tables. I have a lot of opinions about tables and how they're generally pretty ugly, but sometimes you need them. And I think like the biggest thing, if I'm given a design. My first thought is, can this be displayed in a Word document, or does it have to be displayed in an Excel sheet? And that kind of determines, do I need a really intense table, or can I turn this into a list or something like that? And trying to find like performance optimizations and stuff like that, because tables are notoriously hard to optimize and generalize, which I think is the hardest part of a design system team, because usually they have business logic built into them and all this other stuff. And so it's really hard to make a component that's easy to use for everybody throughout the company. And then on top of that, we also have graphs, and those are also another hard thing to generalize for everybody. I think everybody has experience with using a graphing library and realizing it's pretty bad. So you try to find another one, and it's just as bad. So just trying to pick your poison,
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this whole subject, we're just jumping with 2 feet into an area that most teams are pretty successful in avoiding with their design system for as long as possible, right? Yep. And we're like, nope, it's the whole thing is about what we otherwise would try and avoid. So yeah, I feel that. And Jen, thank you for your patience. Well, tell us a little bit about your world of Integrate and how the subject shows up there.
Sure. Well, like Jeff, data tables are fresh on my mind, and something that we're always trying to problem solve around. And so the first thing that popped in my head was thinking about just all of the different states and all of the different things that could go wrong when you're dealing with large amounts of data and coming from different places. And so thinking about, how do you display data when there's a little bit of data, a lot of data, no data, an error retrieving that data, and that's not always something that comes up naturally in the design process. So that is fresh on my mind. I also didn't realize that this is the world that I have been in my entire professional career, and I never really thought of it. It's just been the water to my fish, and so I'm excited to kind of unearth these unique challenges and have some fellow colleagues sympathizing with the challenges here. So I came from fintech, now in martech, and yeah, excited to dive in.
Awesome. So there's a common thread there in a few of those comments around sort of requirements in a way, right? And you spoke about it, Jackie, you started talking a little bit about the design process. Joe, you're talking about like at a moment of handoff, trying to understand and say, hey, is this a thing that I could handle one way or another? And Jen, as you just said, I mean, you're often finding that things like error states and things you run into are probably harder than in less complex experiences to ID maybe upfront. So maybe just broadly, and anyone can take this, how do you find that not just requirements definition, but how design and engineering work together to understand and tackle requirements? How does that shift, or how is that different in this than supposedly talking about a simpler UI design that isn't, so data intense?
I'd like to take a stab at that.
Yeah.
So just step back a little bit, right? Do we even have the scope, right? Because, sometimes to be able to communicate between design and development, we kind of have to understand what's the business scope. What is it that our business have for those data table? If we're just talking about data table right now, how many different cells do we have, right? Like how many different styles do we have for those cells? And are those, do we do like some kind of audit across everything that we need to just be able to list out all of those different cell styles? And on top of that, being able to reduce it and communicate back to the business to, somehow consolidate this before we even have this talk between design and development. So that's something I wanted to address.
Yeah, I think building on what you said, Jackie, I think it is really important to step back and identify that data table is kind of the mother of all composable components, right? Like I've been listening a lot to Brad Frost and Nathan Curtis talk with Chris on the Knapsack podcast recently, and composability comes up quite a bit, right? And when you work on data table, I think first there are a whole bunch of features and requirements that, like you said, you need to talk to a variety of product teams to understand how to abstract those and bring those into something that is actually usable for everybody. But then there's also this conversation around, we maybe need mini versions of every single form control that will fit in our data grid. And it's like, oh, wow. Like, in order to support all of this stuff, we're going to have to go and touch like half of the components in our system or something, because they're going to have to slot into these tinier cells in the data table. And so I think all of that is kind of the pre-work or the discovery. And then you just need to slot that into your normal kind of feature workflow for any component, but do it kind of one chunk at a time, like break it down into what's this first version going to be, what is not going to be. It's, I think, as important to identify what is not going to be in the first version as what is going to be in it.
Building off of both of those things, you jogged my memory about so many conversations that we had. When you're moving fast as a product organization, there's this sense of urgency around everything. And so when you're talking about the system, you get an opportunity to ask those questions of, okay, what is the value with this? Do we want to add this much complexity to our table? How is this going to interact with the existing functionality of our table? And asking a lot of those what ifs around, well, how does row expansion work with search and pagination? And how are we going to handle that? It just brings up so much, so that scope starts to explode. And so I think having those, it has changed the way that we collaborate and how we have those conversations together earlier now, so that we don't have this unrealistic expectation of what we can deliver, and really bringing everybody into, okay, when we ask for this, to your point, Jeff, this requires all of these component enhancements, a condensed version. I feel seen when you said that. So just bringing everybody into that understanding.
Yeah, and it's really, I mean, I've heard people in the industry talk about how a similar component, like a date picker, there's a ton of functionality there as well. And when they go out and they do that survey or discovery, they come back and the answer is, we can't actually have a date picker that serves all the needs of 25 different products. And so it's not something that actually lives at that core design system level. So that's part of that conversation as well, is considering, should the data table even live at the core layer? And that is dependent on those conversations that you have with product people.
Yeah, I'm was having a similar thought. I made the comment earlier that a lot of teams can avoid for a long time quite successfully solving for the data table, because there's other obvious things that are in that Venn diagram overlap for their product orgs that they can focus on. If all of your products are focused on this, this is the reusable part. So I guess the question in there is, do you find it's a different process, or it's harder to actually identify what is that set of reusable things in this more complex, these complex UI patterns? And like, how do you manage that in the early stages?
Kind of just to tug on the composable table. Our table was originally called composable table, and then it went through many iterations, and now on the React side, we currently have, it's called Simple Table. And you can imagine it's not simple, not anymore at least. And so it's just like, it's one of those things where it's like, we try to distill it down, and a lot of that was driven by product engineers. So we didn't have like a dedicated design system team at that point. And so whenever a need came up in product, those product engineers were the ones actually making those additions and making it, you know, a complex table instead of a simple table kind of deal. And it's just kind of interesting to think about, you know, should it live at the design system layer? Should this be like a business logic layer? And so we kind of had actually two separate design systems. We had our component library, and then we had a business logic component library that was like hooked into routing and stuff like that. So it's kind of how we split it up.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, it's definitely higher in terms of complexity. What I like to do is look at examples of other public systems that have already solved some of this, and then try to figure out, okay, what was successful for these that are already good working examples, and how does that connect to what our product requirements are? The best example of data intense design system that I've pointed people to for years was something that I discovered way back in 2018 at a Nathan Curtis workshop, because he was actually working with Morningstar on their design system. And so I point people to the Morningstar design system, and their data table example is amazing because it shows you, okay, here are the 6 different components that make up data table, but also, and I think maybe most importantly, here are examples of the data table populated the way that it would be in product. And so they're actually showing real use cases. And I think that goes that extra mile, or that extra whatever it is, to get, you know, product people who are coming and looking at the documentation to say, hey, oh, that actually reflects what I need to build. And it gets them kind of excited and improves adoption. So it's always a really good reference. And maybe I can drop the URL in chat or something.
Yeah, please. Yeah, I think that, I mean, that's such a, you know, interesting part of this is that more so than with anything else that we're putting lorem ipsum into, you know, at some point, right? The content is going to dictate so much of the experience, which kind of makes a waterfall process, you know, a little significantly less viable, right? Or, you know, more of a crapshoot at least. So is that something, I mean, Jackie being on the design side, is that something that you find, you know, the design team needs to be incorporating data and real examples a lot earlier in the process in order to create effective outcomes and minimize all the back and forth and chaos?
Well, definitely. I feel like to give examples on how different cell styles is being used, it will be definitely helpful in the design process. But one thing that Jeff touched on, and which is something that you want to talk about, Andrew, is the consumerization of products, right? So like when we talk about consumerization of product in a B2B environment, we tend to think, okay, well, consumerization is more like B2C, right? But then who's behind those businesses? It's like we're all individuals, we're all people who consume these products that's out there. So when we start designing these products, we will be drawing ideas or inspirations from these consumer products, and then bring it back to B2B designs. And then the consumers, speaking from the other side, the consumers are not like this organization. They're also built with individuals who also have similar experiences with consumer product that you do. So there is the back-to-back chicken and egg thing that is going on here. So yeah.
Yeah, we were talking in a prep session about how, you know, this conversation wasn't much of a conversation, at least not cross-functionally 10, 15 years ago, because if you had something that was a lot of data, it was probably being designed to the extent that it was by the product engineering team, because it was you know, especially if you're talking about an enterprise, a warehouse application or something, you know, not a lot of teams were investing heavily in UX of those sorts of products, especially when it's going to be such a, you know, tech and data-driven experience. And that's just not the expectation anymore, right? Everything has to feel like Nike and Apple and, you know, Airbnb and feel sexy and intuitive to interact with. And so that, you know, poses a whole new set of challenges here. And I think it ties in with a question or a comment that Tony from Acutech, hey Tony, that he dropped in, which is, you know, he's noticed this trend. Tony leads a design team and design system effort at Acutech. software company, and they've identified that he says basically everyone defaults to a data table, right? Oh, I got a lot of data. There's a table, and certainly the table is appropriate, but a table also doesn't have a lot of hierarchy to information density and presentation, right? And so it can also be just too flat in some cases. Also, you might need a lot of data. So, Joe, you mentioned that. The gut check of like, could this be a Word doc or an Excel doc? So how do you all, as just cross-functional teams, how do you kind of keep yourselves accountable and honest that we're working towards the best, purpose-built solution and not just a lazy, for lack of a better word, solution of, well, it's a lot of data, let's just use a big data table? How do you make sure you come up with a great solution?
If I can take a stab at that.
Please.
Kind of like what I said earlier, like it starts with, can this fit in a Word doc or can it fit in an Excel sheet? And then if it can fit in an Excel sheet, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a table. Do I need sorting by column, grouping, like all of that? It's just kind of like going down, what does a data table actually give me? And do I need that? Do I need like, hundreds of columns or like just 5, things of data? Can I turn it into a list? Can I turn it into like a tile instead? Something a little bit more eye-popping or something like that. I'm not a designer, so usually I have a really good relationship with my designers, and so it's a lot of like back and forth, like, hey, like maybe we can tweak this a little bit. But that's kind of like my first go-to is, do I need a table for all the functionality a table gives me? If I don't need a table.
For us, it's not as. Go ahead.
Jen, you go ahead.
Sure.
Yeah.
For lack of a better term, I just try to encourage my team to be continue to be lazy engineers. We don't want to build extra stuff, and so we try to ask all those questions, and that's good friction. And so it's very easy to get into a habit of just being implementers and feeling like that's your job. Just come in, build the thing you're told to build. But there's a lot of value in having those conversations about, well, this is a huge effort. Let's talk about what we're trying to achieve first. Let's put the design aside, let's put the component aside, and really focus on what are we trying to achieve for our users. And then it might open up some different possibilities we hadn't thought about. That's been the most helpful thing, even though it feels kind of tense sometimes to do that.
Jackie, what were you going to add?
Yeah, I was going to add that for us, it's not as flexible because a lot of our data is coming from data. It's coming from Excels. So a lot of times we do have to align the looks and feel of certain things, or at least the gist of it, to our web products. So those are, how do you translate between what you have data-wise in Excel to the web platform? Those are some of our challenges.
Sure. So I was speaking with someone earlier today that works on a very data-heavy product UI, essentially for internal scientists within their organization. And they need to, he was pointing out how he's like, we may actually have 40 rows and 30 columns in a table, and they need to see almost all of it at once, right? They're used to looking at big swaths of data, which when I talk about consumerization of enterprise, my tendency as a human that uses digital stuff is not to do that, is not to give them 120 cells, right? And so do you find that there is kind of ever a conflict or the gut check necessary to be like, I have my tendency of what I think makes a nice, clean, intuitive UI, and then I have the requirements for this purpose that I'm building for, which is honestly not a thing probably anyone on this call is going to use that much, unless maybe banking and things like that, right? So do you find you have to kind of check your own, just like design good heuristic experience tendencies more so than normal? Joe's nodding furiously. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like a lot of times we, coming from design, and I'm a designer, so we love like white space, give me something clean to look at. But putting myself in my user's mind, a lot of times they do want to see all of that information right in front of them, because it's a lot of information to retain and also cross-reference. So therefore, it's important to pack as much information as possible. And how do you juggle between something looking good and beautiful, and then also absorbable, consumable, at the same time being able to give them as much information as possible. We're looking at how you layer it, like visual hierarchy and then color hierarchy, style hierarchy. Those are some of the tools that we can use other than just space hierarchy, right? Because we have to work with what is usable, what is going to work for our users. So a lot of time B2B, where our users sometimes, or for design system, our users are not the end customer yet. It's our internal team members, and they are the first customer, right? And then it trickles down to the user experience. What's the end user experience is going to be like? And a lot of times the end user experience is very much similar to our team experience, what they're asking for, because they do want to see more information packed in, and they don't want to skip to another page to look at something and then go back to the previous page to cross-reference those information. It is a lot of information to retain because it is a data-rich experience.
Sarah in the chat dropped a good question, which is like, at what point though is it not usable? We need to balance. We have a lot of things that need to be dense and all this info, but also I need to be usable and consumable. And that is overwhelming to human brains, not meant to process all that information at once. So how do you, Jackie, just pick on you again, how do you balance that challenge?
Well, first of all, you'll have to delineate between the certain hierarchical levels of your information, right? What are some of the information that can take, if you're doing painting, I'm just, pulling out painting, like what is going to be your background layer? How are you going to pile on top of that? What do you want the information to shine, right? Those are some like some of the painting reference of it, right? Because you're looking at a painting that is going to be very busy, but somehow you see those spotlights and you see them first, and then you're noticing the different layers, right? So those are some of the things that you want to balance, and that is not where that balance is not for anyone to answer. It's for your organization and your user to answer, and different organization might have different needs, and that is something that you need to work it out and balance it out by communicating with your users. And it's never a silo the way you work on things. It has to be communicative.
Yeah, I think one exercise that is actually potentially very valuable for data table is looking at it from a mobile first perspective, because I've seen a lot of attempts to take data heavy tables and fit them into a mobile form factor. And so getting everybody in the room who has opinions or will be able to make decisions on that. And then looking at, like you said, Jackie, the hierarchy, and also with the lens of what are these users trying to accomplish. I've been in or privy to conversations where it's like, oh, these are accountants and they're never going to not be on the desktop, right? And so, those are conversations that you need to have to help identify and whittle down what is like the core thing that people need to accomplish, and how will it fit into this smaller form factor, and are we only going to display just those bare bones things? And then that can, I think, help inform some of the desktop conversations.
Yeah, I think there's also a trend here that we're starting to see, or that we certainly see the potential for systems to enable, which is a really, really hyper-personalized approach to any application UI, right? With everything that's happened in the tokens and variables space, and sort of the breakdown of most application interfaces into this microservices model, where it's less of a big monolith. The potential exists for us to say, you know what, we could have one component, one experience of a data dashboard, and one user could choose to have a more dense experience, and one user could have a less dense experience. Today teams do that by building that feature in, but like the core architecture of how web UIs in particular get delivered is a lot better suited to enable that type of customization now or in the next year than it has been in a long time. Do you think that is something to lean into, because we're talking about the challenge of just being a human interacting with something and being a product team trying to make something useful? Is that something that, you think would make sense to lean more into, and let people have a little more control over how they, the personal aspect of how they interact with your experiences?
So we have a transactions table. So we're spend and expense software, or that's the part that I work on mostly. And we have a transactions table, and that table is very heavily customized and for that particular team of engineers. And then they've allowed users to then organize the columns and stuff like that. And so I think that that's like one way to make too much data consumable, is like, okay, well, what data do I find most important? Shove all these columns off the screen. And then I have my 5 set, columns that I want to see just instantly without having to scroll. That's a big thing. Kind of just like on the topic of too much data is consumable. If you have an expandable row in your table when you click it, like that's too much already. That's my opinion. Have a drawer or something. That's like one of the biggest designs that like my consumers, so like my engineers will come and be like, hey, can we have an expandable row? And I was like, why? Why do you need it? There are cases for it, but typically I try to push back on it as much as possible because it's not accessible and it makes the table even harder to read.
And then you get the fun expand all rows interaction, which is
Yep.
just like, I wish I hadn't clicked that. I'm overwhelmed. Yeah. I want to shift in a little bit and talk about charts too, but while we're on the spicy topic of tables, there was a question in here in the chat from Laura, which is a good one, which is how do you determine at your company what table features should be included in the design system and what should stay at a product level? Which is another angle of the like, okay, if you can't avoid this anymore, what part of this whole thing do you bite off? Is it the table? Is it specific patterns of interaction, like Jen was saying, around how different mechanisms interact? Like how do you figure out what to bite off at the system level first?
I can take a stab at this one. So, I mean, it depends on a few things. I mean, first, it depends on how many products are you supporting? What's the variety there? Have you done work to define the different tiers? Do you understand the difference between, like, we have a core tier, we've got this like other layer or other tier. This is like systems of systems territory, right? But like all of that has to kind of be defined, and it's not just defining what are the different tiers, it's who owns it, who's responsible for maintaining it, all of those different pieces. And so once you have that kind of outlined and there's a shared understanding of that, then you can better make decisions on, this should maybe live in a library that is a little bit closer to product for the time being. And maybe we'll pilot it there and we'll see how it does. If it's really successful, then we'll bring it back in and promote it to the core layer. Or it's already, being used by a whole bunch of people and the need is more immediate, and then we can look at like bringing it into the core layer. But those are, like I said, they're dependent on the teams, the products, and all those different tiers that you've got defined.
Yeah, and I like that you call out. I mean, it's in or out, right? Or it's in the core system or the product system. I think honestly, almost every conversation we have these days, Knapsack is turning into a systems of systems conversation. And it's there's various Venn diagram overlaps. And yeah, there's a foundational thing. There's components, maybe patterns. There's different, business lines. There's different ways that teams organize it. But the idea that we can embrace the systematic approach and the idea of reuse with different sort of connected centers of gravity, right? Not everything applies to everyone, but also where there is overlap, we want to operationalize and recognize the efficiency of that overlap. So I think it's a great call. And it also speaks to, we're also touching on another popular concept we've probably all read a Medium article about around sort of paste layering, right? Something that we see a lot with design system teams where the system is moving a lot slower than products. And someone else asked me today about a color picker and like, can you really make a complex color picking experience a standard component across a business that has hundreds of apps that use it? I said, I generally believe yes, but you may not know what the common part is until 10 teams have implemented a color picker. You should let them share and like maybe build off each other, but we're not going to know just because we need it once or even 10 times what the right thing to centralize is. Is it a base unstyled thing with some functionality in JavaScript? Is it a whole UI? I don't know, right? And I think this comes up more probably in these types of experiences, even than the simpler components in most of the design systems out there, because there's a lot of nuance, right? And as someone said in one of these questions too, even just like at some point creating a template for a data table might be more limiting than helpful if the nuance of every implementation is so distinct, right? So I think it's not necessarily a different process than any other design system figuring out what should we have in the system, but I think being really aware of and expect that like we're going to move kind of slowly because standardization is going to be a little bit harder to pinpoint. At least that's kind of my sense, and it seems like Jeff wants to say he agrees.
Okay.
And the three really quick, just like the things that you can communicate to people are, have you identified the shared value? Have we established shared value across various products? Are you, how quickly do you need it? Like, do you need it next week or do you need it in 6 months? And does your team have availability to contribute? And what does that availability look like? Do you have a designer that's half-time? Do you have an engineer that's twiddling their thumbs right now and could jump on this immediately, right? Like, so those three questions can generally get you, point you in the right direction as to whether something needs to be in the core layer or can live at the product layer for the time being. And sorry, Jackie, I think you were going to say something.
Yeah. I'm just adding to all of that. Completely agree with both you and Andrew. Yeah, like design systems sometimes should not go too fast before product because it will be limiting how product will use these things. You want to see what is being pushed out based on the product needs and then gather those nuances and then build it into your design system. So you want to use that 80-20 rules. If it's like not being utilized or if it's being utilized 20% of the times, you don't want to, spend all that time built into a design system when it's not being used. And sometimes it hasn't even been flushed out yet to know what those nuances are, right? So you wanted to be able to see that across different platforms and different products before you go ahead and build that component for, to release for everyone to use. And standardization is it's a whole topic on itself. So yeah.
Yeah, our so at Bill, we kind of have two different cultures around design systems. Because we had Divi and then Bill, and then we became one. Divi didn't have a very specific design system team, and so it was very, very product engineer driven and design driven. So a lot of that came down to, okay, does this belong in our component library? Should this be here? Is this a one-off? And we kind of had this like unspoken rule of like, if it's used more than 3 times, it should probably be in the component library. If you know it's going to be used more than 3 times, just build it in the component library to begin with, kind of deal. So.
I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about something other than tables. So we mentioned charts. That other one that quickly comes to mind feels a little more designy and interactive than a table, which is either makes it easier or more complex. So starting broadly, charts. Does everything we just said apply to charts as well as it's the same as tables? Do we find that as we go to different flavors of data-rich experiences, there's more nuance to deal with? Like let's go beyond table.
I like to tie that question back into the anonymous attendees question regarding third-party vendors. Yeah, because I think there's a lot of cross overlap between that question and the question. So
let me just read that for folks who can't see that, right? So someone asked if there's a lot of third-party tools that impact the way people are interacting with data that you at your company may not have control over, right? And so I think broadly, the question is, do we have any tips on, how to enforce standards, but also like what tips would we give to a designer who's trying to make these experiences and make them feel really intuitive and usable for anybody, right? Because it's also not necessarily a data scientist. It's like, Jen, you deal with marketers looking at, lead campaigns, same kind of thing, right? How do you approach that? So yeah, Jackie, go for it.
Yeah, so definitely third-party vendor platform tools are out there, and they are sometimes a lot helps your product to push out a lot quicker than utilizing your development team. Sometimes you just don't have the bandwidth to take on that additional task, and sometimes the product itself you just want to test it out, and then maybe utilizing third-party vendors and tools to just kind of feel it out, feel the market out. One of the things that you might want to consider is to identify what are your colors, so like with charts and graphs, it's color, like the colors that you use for them is going to be very important. So you might want it to come up with a list of your chart color hierarchies so that you recycle them and utilize them for different tools. That way you stay consistent across all of your homemade charts and graphs, and at the same time align with your third-party vendor tools. And these third-party vendor tools, I have to say, like they're very, very much customizable to a certain degree, and then they have their own logic to it. So you can't really align too much to, like, it's not one-to-one alignment to your design system. However, it is going to give you enough of a alignment where it does look and feel like part of your system. So those are some of the things that you might want to look into.
Yeah, and on that note of design tokens, again, the kind of Morningstar example, they have semantic tokens for both visualizations and chart. Just if you go in and look at like their constants, but then they even have a visual language section where they talk about the application of those semantic tokens to their charts. And so it's kind of a double-pronged approach of like, yes, we've got whole bunch of colors that are applied just to graphs and visuals. And then here's how we actually apply them. It can lead into a little bit of like a rainbow feel because there are quite a few colors that you end up having to use with charts, but as much direction that you can give teams to show, here's what we're recommending. I think that kind of leads to success.
With the charts and accessibility comment, it just made me think about colors in charts are really important. We kind of already touched on it a little bit, but like a lot of it is like the perception of that color's brightness. And if each bar has a different brightness, that's better. Because if you put them in grayscale and they have the same like grayscale value, it already just, the information just doesn't parse. And so I've been evangelizing this since I found it. Material.io, they have their own like color theory called HCT, and it's around tone rather than HSL, which is about lightness. Tone is about the grayscale tone that color occupies, and it really helps with like generating accessible colors and stuff like that, making sure that they are on different tone values. I have a link to it. Can post that in the chat. But they also have a library now that people can use for engineers. That's really awesome. And then just making sure that like that information is tied really well with like, text detailing what those charts are, what those colors stand for and stuff like that. It's really important. And then there was one question about like favorite third-party packages, specifically for charts. That's really hard because they're all kind of like their own flavor of hard to work with. But I think Victory Charts is probably the one that like I've found to be the easiest to accomplish like anything that a designer throws at me. So yeah.
So on that anything a designer throws at me, Jen, I'm going to bring it back to you because you said something a little bit ago about expectations, and we talk about expectation gaps a lot. And I think design systems, and when we have tools like Knapsack that can bring design and code next to each other, a lot of it is about closing the expectation gap so we don't all get to QA and say, but I thought it would look like this, right? Which we've all done too often in the last 3 decades. So I'm curious, in this world though, with like, you take what Joe was just talking about, you can in design define the chart interactions, the way we're going to use color, all of that to be great and accessible, but you're really not going to know what it feels like to interact with this thing until I have live data in it, right? Even more so than where the text is going to wrap. So how do you, in designing and building for a data-rich world, how do you manage that expectation gap? Do you find that there is more QA than even the best case when we have, other scenarios? Like how does that design dev product expectation gap management change in this world?
Yeah, I have seen it's been so much less of a handoff. I think the work really begins when you have that initial design, but then getting it into code to start playing around with real scenarios faster has been really beneficial. So trying to do that earlier and save the designer a lot of time of trying to create all of these different states in Figma or whatever design tool. But to get the data in there, some realistic mock data, and stress test it, try it out with different scenarios, because that's when you start to go, oh, I didn't even think about what happens when that area of that pie chart gets this small, and how are we gonna, what do the tooltips look like, and just all of those things that don't typically come up, and it's so much easier to get it up there and looking at it in code as quickly as you can. And I like victory charts too, and recharts, just to add on to that discussion. And if you really want to get fancy, side charts has been pretty cool. Some heat maps and things like that.
You made me think as you're saying that it's an area where maybe this part of the system practice world is in some ways ahead of a lot of teams. Like what you just said around getting things to code faster so we can all see and feel and like we preach that all day for everything. Doesn't matter if you're talking about a chart or not, right? And we love seeing the industry hit this inflection point where you can use Knapsack to get people assembling in code. We've got Figma and Builder.io doing webinars around get it into code. We've got Supernova doing a language prompt to show you things with your code, right? The idea that digital production can be better suited to the medium we're working in is taken hold. We think that's awesome. And in many ways, this world of working on data-rich experiences kind of so necessitates that, to the point Jen just made, right? Like we need to be able to see and feel and touch and interact, and we're never going to do that in design. We're just not, right? You can't even pretend we're going to. If someone else said in a comment, like, you have to break components even just to do it, in Figma half the time. Like, I wonder if that's in some ways a Trojan horse or a thing that teams can lean into more, because the more you do that for every part of your design, the less you're going to have a stakeholder say, why is the fold there? Or, whatever else they're saying in the QA environment. So that's an interesting just takeaway for me that I think we can look at, like, how would you handle this collaborative design and build process if there's no way to know in design what it would look and feel like, really, right? Which is essentially the case of charts. Because I think to embrace that and do it all the time, that's what I would preach.
I would say it's essential for data tables and charts and anything like this, because I'm sure we've all had experience with even the simplest of components. Like you have like a checkbox and you go to build it, and then as you're bringing it back to design, it's like, well, this thing didn't have an active state. And it was just something that was overlooked by the designer in their original design work. And so those are things that you don't realize until you get to working in code. And so if it happens on the smallest of the smallest, it's going to just happen more in some of these larger components. So I would say definitely essential.
Yeah, I mean, I would put that as a tool in anyone who's listening's tool belt, especially if you're early and you're figuring out how to make systems work. At least having a dedicated thought process around, what is a more complex or a really data or content driven UI element, like circle that and prioritize it somewhere in this planning around, like, I want to tackle that, if only because I want to force us all to live through this process where there's no way we can just go waterfall. It's just like not even viable, right? Because then the more that you can plant that seed and, build around that concept, it's worth trying to use that again. It's almost a Trojan horse to change the way you work. So we've got a little bit of time left. If there's other questions in the chat, in the audience, please drop them in the Q&A. Curious, just with the time we have, folks going around the room, anything that, burning thoughts around this subject that we haven't dug into, anything beyond the chart and the table? Are there other complex components? Parting thoughts in the last few minutes here as we wind down.
I think Daypicker rounds it out. Yeah, the trio of super complex data intense components. Yeah, my closing thought is I guess with any of these, you know, date picker charts, data grid, you really have to have your workflow established. You really have to have, like we discussed, those tiers in place, and really understand what the scope is going to be and communicate it early and often. Getting that scope creep under control is, I think, essential with anything that is this data heavy. So
we touched on this a little bit earlier about providing realistic examples and how can teams put together these composable pieces. How can we keep the system pretty generic and but still connected to our product? But how can we very quickly give engineering teams and teams a glimpse into how could you put this together, and here are some ways to do that, and here are some combinations, and it also encourages that consistency that you want to do. I know we're fairly small, so we try to keep things fairly flexible, but we still want to create consistency in our product. And so examples have been a way to do that, and it's also a great check for us as we're building components to keep us connected to what does it feel like to implement this thing. It's so easy to get disconnected from that. And so there's been so many times as we're building the example when we go, this API doesn't really make sense, or this is a frustrating part about it. So I definitely recommend building those examples and staying close to the implementation.
A little user empathy goes a long way. Joe, Jackie, Joe, go ahead.
Building on date picker. Throughout my career, I have had to build probably like 6 or 7 date pickers at various different times. And seeing the chat, you know, everybody kind of having that reaction of like, this makes engineers cry. It does. But it's always interesting that the requirements are so different every time I'm given a date picker, but they're also the same. Like everybody wants to be able to customize the format and all this other stuff. And like, even right now, I'm actually working on a date picker right now. And I've been trying to like enforce, like our content team wants the display of the date to be a very specific way. And I was like, can we make it as close to the standard HTML like input date type as possible? And I can do like a custom calendar, all this other stuff. Can we make it as close to that as possible so that it's like standardized? We don't have to care about format. It's accessible. Like I don't have to do all that extra work. And the answer is usually no, which is hard because then now you have to like implement all of this extra functionality. Then you have to find the most up to date like date library and all this other stuff. And so it's just very fun. It's a lot. Anyway, that's just my thought on that.
Yeah, to add to that, oh my God. I don't know if you guys also came across what is your fiscal year starts from. What does year to date? Right. So those are everybody, the different companies might have different, you know, fiscal year starting date. Right. So those are a lot. And then also across the world, like the time, like what time do you use, you know? So we're talking, it's definitely more complex, and maybe we wanted to think about compartmentalize some of these things and then have multiple sets for different use case. Another thing is, I just wanted to add back to the third-party usage. Another tip for that is maybe you wanted to create a template utilizing the third-party one, and that way everybody who's using that template can stay consistent with all of the product that you push out. And rounding thought, maybe like, I think for us, maybe maps is the next thing on my list. It's gonna be like, you have the geopolitical challenges, you have all the other things, and then so yeah, so that is going to add to the whole entire complexity.
Yeah, you know, so in summary, it's funny, like in many ways, everything we've talked about is just the good best practice for anyone working on any product or design system, right? We got to understand our users, the specific use case, buck our own assumptions, you know, validate, collaborate, get closer to code. You know, but at the same time, there's a lot more nuance and gotchas and things to look out for. But this is great. I love seeing comments from people saying, essentially, oh man, I'm glad it's not just us, right? This is a lot of the vibe we get in our leadership summits where everyone's like, I'm so glad I'm not crazy. And, we all have to stop and remember occasionally that very few people and teams have done all of this, what we're all trying to do successfully once, much less multiple times. And so feels very natural to be looking over your shoulder and like, I don't know, we're using this library, we're doing this. I'll tell you later if it worked. I think everyone's really in the same boat. So I appreciate you all joining, spending some time, sharing your perspective, giving people a little bit of that group therapy. It goes a long way. And thank you everyone for joining. Again, we'll share out the recording. We'll probably, break down some of the things that came from this, post some blogs, do all the other things we do with content. But I appreciate you all being a part of this, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thanks to all of our panelists. Appreciate it.